Hi there and welcome to the Byline podcast with me, Adrian Goldberg. This time has Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu been running rings around Joe Biden? And if so, what does that mean for Kamala Harris in the US presidential election? In the aftermath of the shocking Hamas attacks on October the 7th, 2023, in which more than 1,100 Israelis died, mostly civilians, and 251 more were taken hostage, Biden said that, of course, the country had the right to defend itself. But like UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, he also urged restraint and has continued to do so in the year since. The result? Well, more than 42,000 Palestinians in Gaza have perished, at least a third of them children. Biden again called for a proportional response after Iran fired rockets into Israel in retaliation for the killing of Iranian-backed Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah by the IDF in Lebanon, Netanyahu's latest war front. Former Israeli diplomat Alon Pinkas has said that Netanyahu is indeed running rings around the US president, who seems powerless to stop him. Who better to discuss this with than another former diplomat, Alex Hall, good friend of Byline Times. Alex has been canvassing for Kamala Harris, the Democrat candidate, in the upcoming US presidential election. She's a former UK ambassador to Georgia and was also a diplomat in Washington at the time of Brexit. So, Alex, you've got the chops for this, so loads to go at here. Of course, Israel saw the horrendous attacks on October the 7th, 2023, as a provocation. But many people around the world see their response as utterly disproportionate in that it is non-combatants, it is children, women who seem to have borne the brunt of their attacks in Gaza. And the fear is that the same is happening now in Lebanon, where, of course, many of the people are not Hezbollah supporters, but there is a lack of discrimination in the attacks that has left many people, including people who are often sympathetic to Israel, feeling very uncomfortable and feeling that something very serious has gone wrong with Israel's response.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me back on your excellent podcast. And just for listeners, I should clarify that I am now an American citizen, which is why I'm able to engage in US politics. I'm not some interfering British diplomat wading my way into American politics. I think it's such a nightmare trying to talk about this topic because no matter how carefully you pick your words, you're almost bound to upset somebody. And the tragedy about the Middle East is people have become more and more entrenched in it's all the fault of Israel or it's all the fault of Hamas and all Palestinians are terrorists. And one of the challenges on the ground is the inability of people in the region to sort of empathize and understand the trauma on the other side or recognize the mistakes their own side has made. And I just want to leap in by saying I slightly take issue with your choice of words that what happened on October the 7th was a provocation, because I don't think that does justice to quite how barbaric and awful and traumatic those attacks were on October the 7th. This was a deep, searing, traumatic event for Israeli society, the worst loss of life since the Holocaust. And at one stroke, removing their sense of security. But then, of course, the other issue is how you view what's currently going on in the region is framed by your sense of time frame and your sense of geographical lens. And what do I mean by that? If you are like President Biden, somebody who first got to know and interact with Israel in the early years after its founding, I mean, Biden is very old, so he will have been traveling and getting to know Israeli leaders very soon after Israel's establishment and when it was attacked by the surrounding Arab states, and it wasn't sure how well Israel would survive. And I think if you come with that starting point, you tend to be very sympathetic to the fact that Israel remains a lone democracy in a very hostile environment. And that frames your prism for how you look at Israel. The other lens is if you broaden the conflict, not just to between Israel and Palestine, but to the region, you understand that what is happening with Israel is from this broader perspective, it's about a wider geopolitical challenge between democracies and authoritarians, where Iran is one of the players alongside Russia and China that is actively trying to undermine the Western world order. And so, again, that tends to push you to seeing Israel facing an existential challenge. And it's part of a front line of resistance to very hostile regimes who share none of our own values. But if your time frame, certainly for me, I got to know and travel to Israel and the West Bank in the 1980s. I was a student in the West Bank. I got to see a very different side. I got to know Palestinians living under occupation. I got stopped at Israeli checkpoints. I got questioned at Ben Gurion Airport. And I made friends with Palestinians who were able to take me to the villages that their parents and grandparents had lived in. That gave me a very different perspective. And then, if your first familiarity with Israel and the Palestinians is the scenes from Gaza, you are going to have a visceral reaction to that because the devastation that's happened to Gaza is beyond fathomable. I mean, it's extraordinary. And so you are going to say, why is Israel doing this? And why are they broadening this to start attacking Lebanon, assassinating people on Iranian soil, and attacking Iran's proxy? I think so much depends on your timeline and your geographical lens as to where you come on this conflict. And people like me, these multiple perspectives, just get attacked for failing to side with one side or the other.
No, I understand that. And I take your point as well about my lack of accuracy using the word provocation. Clearly, what happened on October the 7th was much more than that. And I stand corrected on that. By the same token, you look at Israel's response in Gaza and having suffered not only that attack, but the historical injustices that Jewish people have suffered throughout the world over many centuries. It baffles me that Israel or Israel's leaders don't understand that visiting the kind of horror that they have upon Gaza will only create martyrs, will create memories that are handed down through the decades, which will be used to fuel anger against them. Never mind the Nakba in 1948, in which the people who you knew as students whose parents had lived in this land were forcibly evicted, ethnically cleansed from their homeland. So I think it's that lack of empathy that the Israeli leadership has shown, notwithstanding that horrendous event on October the 7th. It's that lack of empathy for the people on the other side of their response that puzzles me.
Yeah, so I didn't come on the show to end up sounding like I was a spokesperson for Israel and defending their every action. I'm extremely critical, and I completely agree that I think what they're doing risks being hugely counterproductive. But again, I would say that there are two sort of big strategic debates here. One is that from Israel's point of view, they tried to make peace with the Palestinians. They withdrew from Gaza in 2005. They offered a deal to the Palestinians on several occasions, and repeatedly the Palestinians either rejected it, although the Palestinians would argue, yes, but Israel, you failed to dismantle all the settlements and honor your side of the bargain. But there was a peace camp in Israel, and a pretty strong peace camp. And that has been eroded through disillusionment and through the failure of multiple peace processes that they had originally tried to support. And so I think there is now a narrative that after October the 7th, they can never allow that to happen. And having tried withdrawing, having tried peace processes. Now, the only option is to be as strong and to defend ourselves, and we have to crush this opposition. But then you look at it from the other lens and say, but why is there this resistance to Israel? Why are so many people trying to attack Israel? And then you say, well, it's because they are continuing to occupy the West Bank. They are building more and more and more settlements. There is a double standards in how Israeli Arabs are treated versus Israeli Jews. There are Palestinians living under occupation. There are less options for them. And Gaza has never been truly independent. It's been suffering a blockade by Israel and by Egypt. And they are hemmed in this territory with limited options for their prosperity and success. Although I have to say, Hamas, as their government, has absolutely crushed any offerings for the Palestinians as well. And so, which is the chicken and which is the egg? Which is the cause and which is the effect? And that's why this issue of timeline is so important. To some of us, it seems obvious that Israel cannot fight to a standstill. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Syrian militants, the Iranian regime, it can't sustain this conflict. And it's not going to wipe out every single militant. And it is going to create more people with a reason for hating Israel because their brother or wife or daughter has been killed by Israel. So that seems self-evident to us. And then, of course, there is the third element in this, which is it also depends on what the political calculations are. And this is where I think we get to the real tragedy, that the current leadership of Israel, the current leadership of Hamas, and the current leadership of Iran are all kind of feeding off each other. And many people have made the observation that Netanyahu was presiding over a very divided country before the war started with Hamas. And in some ways, it's given him a lifeline because as long as the war is going on, there's not going to be an election. He has successfully held off and delayed requests for there to be a commission of inquiry into how Israel was caught so unprepared, and also to look at his strategy prior to the war, which was to focus on Lebanon and the West Bank and kind of let Hamas do its own thing in Gaza. So Netanyahu has all sorts of vested reasons for wanting to keep this war going, to stave off scrutiny of himself and to keep himself in power. And he's also dependent for staying in power by being in bed in a coalition with some very, very extreme right-wing groups in Israel who are threatening to bring his coalition down if he offers any compromise. And then on Hamas's side, these sort of brutal thugs, I don't think they care about the number of deaths in Palestine. It creates more martyrs for them. It rallies more people to their cause. And of course, they're hoping that Hezbollah and Iran get drawn into this as well. And they don't care how many Palestinians die. So there is a dynamic there that is very difficult. And so then you come to what can the US do or what can the international community do? And here again, I think this is another sort of prism and framing issue. Joe Biden is trying to handle many crises around the world. He also has an election coming up that, from his point of view, is an existential one concerning the very viability of American democracy, given the perception that Donald Trump is a fundamental threat to American democracy. So the last thing he wants is a huge war in the Middle East, adding to the sense that the world is on fire and it's all gone to hell on his watch. So his motives are trying to tamp things down, to make sure Israel isn't destroyed, to offer security for Israel, but to prevent this escalating into a wider war. Netanyahu's objectives are just to stay in power. So Netanyahu only has to worry about Israel and himself. Biden has to worry about what's going on across the world. And of course, the longer this conflict goes on, and the more there are perceptions that the US is either applying double standards or is unable to exert any influence over Israel, the more America's standing internationally is damaged, and the more it risks emboldening other actors around the world. So it's hugely complicated.
I'll come back to what Biden might or could do in a moment. Just to say the most recent episode of this podcast, we spoke to Uri Veltman and Eran Nissan, who are both two peace activists in Israel, two Jewish peace activists seeking to unite with their Arab Palestinian brothers and sisters. So that peace camp does still exist, but I take your point that after October the 7th, it became much harder for that voice to be heard in Israel. I just want to talk about the strategic importance of Israel. You've suggested that one of the reasons that the United States and the West generally backs Israel is that it is a lone democracy in the Middle East. But the West, let's be honest, is quite happy to make friends with dictators and tyrants when it suits it. For example, the West is very friendly with Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia has lots of oil. So what underlies the West's support for Israel beyond that it's a democracy? Is it the fact that it is a key location geopolitically in an area where there is a lot of oil and it's helpful for the West to have an ally in that area? Is it because there is a lot of Jewish American money which is supportive of Israel, which is used to back politicians, which is used to bring pressure to bear in the media?
Again, like with everything to do with this country, there are many different levels. I think there is a genuine embedded sense of historical duty to protect Israel stemming from what happened in World War II. There is a sort of a legacy of guilt. And that certainly, for example, explains very strong German support for Israel, that sort of legacy of what happened. And, this is the Jewish homeland. So I think there is a genuine, sincere commitment to Israel from that point of view. There is then the fact that Israel has had to struggle for its survival through its early years that reinforced that. And then, yes, I do think there are very effective money and lobbyists, certainly in the US, but I would also argue in the UK. I'm not as familiar with other countries. Of course, it's been well known. There is a very powerful, I tend not to use the word Jewish. I always think in terms of Israel rather than religion, possibly because I'm not religious. I call it the Jewish lobby. The best known of these is AIPAC, and it used to be a requirement for any US politician seeking high office that they would, a little bit like being an NRA supporter if you're a Republican, it was a kind of acid test, a litmus test that you expressed support for Israel. And then events since then reinforced that. The attack on 9/11 brought home for many Americans the kind of terrorist threat that some would argue Israel has experienced. Then you have politicians like Donald Trump whipping up anti-immigrant sentiment, and particularly Donald Trump introduced this Muslim ban. The sort of sense of immigrant and Muslim and terrorist has become elided until they're all terrorists, whereas Israelis are our democratic friends. So I think there are so many different layers. But I will tell you anecdotally that I was at a conference a few weeks ago with a former British Conservative MP who actually went on air to support Keir Starmer's introduction of a partial weapons ban for Israel. And he told me that he got absolutely lambasted, and all his colleagues in the Conservative Party, his former colleagues, went after him for daring to say it was right to restrain some weapons to Israel. And he said there is a lot of money there. There's a lot of Israeli or Jewish money there. The Conservative Friends of Israel is a very powerful group.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sensitivity about this because, of course, one of the biggest historical anti-Semitic tropes is that Jews control the world with their money. And that's emphatically what you and I are not talking about here, but it is a reality of the world, of the West, that there are some very rich Jewish people who affiliate, who identify with Israel, and like other ethnic groups around the world who may live distant to the land from which they also have an affiliation, they will attempt to bring their influence to bear. That's what people do, isn't it? So let's be clear, we're not subscribing to any anti-Semitic global Jewish money conspiracy, but Jews who support Israel will seek to support Israel through the media, through politics, and through whatever means are at hand, as other groups do.
Can I just throw in another observation? I mean, I'm a British expat now living in America and privileged to have American citizenship. And I love the UK and I still have connections. But I think if you are Jewish, the connection to Israel is far, far stronger. I don't have this sort of sense of biblical connection to London as the crucible and cradle of my group's origins in the way that I think Israelis feel that sort of biblical historical connection. And so I think there is a sort of a degree of extra fervor that is not necessarily replicated with other expat groups. I mean, of course, you have like an Armenian diaspora, you have an Indian diaspora, you have a Bangladeshi or a Pakistani diaspora, and they also feel connections to their homeland. But I think it is this sort of special status of Jerusalem as the crucible of three of the world's major religions that makes it a particularly potent mix as well.
Yeah, and I think the horrors of the Holocaust, in which my grandparents perished, also makes that, for some Jewish people, a particularly close thing.
Exactly. I'm going to throw out one other thought, though, which is that you do have a lot of other money coming into politics and other players. I mean, the Gulf states are now very rich, very active, and very active in funding think tanks and programs at universities and in Washington, D.C. So I would argue that there is competition there.
In terms of Biden, I suppose my underlying point, really, and the reason I'm keen to broker this discussion on the podcast, and it's been great to have your insight and the kind of considered way you look at these things. It's why you were a successful diplomat, Alex.
Well, some would say I wasn't a successful diplomat, but well,
but Biden, I would suggest, and Starmer, of course, but Biden's the real power here, just has not been successful in urging restraint upon Netanyahu. And he's tried to urge restraint pretty much at every step of the way since October the 7th, 2023, notwithstanding defending the right of Israel to defend itself. What levers has he got? What pressure can he bring to bear? Because so far, none of it seems to have counted for much.
I think he's got levers and he doesn't want to use them. I mean, it is astonishing to me that after a year of conflict, in August, the administration signed over another 20 billion or million, I've lost count now of the size, but another vast tranche of aid and assistance to Israel. And that is, huge leverage, is calling out Israel, being much tougher and not backing Israel no matter what. And I don't understand why the administration has allowed themselves to be played like this, because Netanyahu seems to have snub and to make life difficult for the Biden administration. And indeed, to be acting in a way that looks like he is trying to facilitate Donald Trump winning the next election, a little bit like Putin would like to see Donald Trump back in the White House as a sort of a stronger friend. I mean, it looks like Netanyahu is getting himself involved in American politics in a way that never used to be the case for previous Israeli leaders. A little bit like British prime ministers knew they always had to maintain good relations with Democrat and Republican leaders. And then, as part of the consequence of Brexit, the Conservative Party became way too intertwined with Republican side in American politics. And that really damaged our relationship with Democrats. And the same has happened with Israel. Netanyahu has blatantly sided with Republicans, has come and addressed the Republican-led House of Representatives. So it's hugely damaging for Israel longer term, this sense of Israel becoming a very sensitive partisan political issue. And I don't know why Biden has stood for it. I really don't. He doesn't want to lose Jewish votes. Of course, he's always going to stand strong for Israel. But on the current trajectory, I think there is a real worry about them losing quite a lot of Arab American votes. And of course, it's not logical that people should vote for Trump if you're really concerned about the Palestinians. But certainly in my experience, just canvassing in my neighborhood, I've met more than a handful of people who've said they're not sure they're going to come out and vote because they really can't stand this administration's policy. They are horrified by what's going on in Gaza. And they say, yeah, we recognize Trump is not going to be great, but I'm just not automatically going to give my vote to the Democrats either. No, it's not particularly logical. It's an emotional decision. But this conflict is raising real emotions. And I hear people all the time say, oh, you weren't so upset when it was Syria, or why aren't you so concerned about what's happening in Sudan? But the difference in Sudan, we're not supporting and shipping arms to either party in Sudan. We are actively shipping arms to Israel. We are actively favoring one side over the other, even on the evidence that Israel has impeded humanitarian aid getting into Gaza, even on the evidence that its bombing has been wildly disproportionate and arguably indiscriminate, we are still standing by Israel. And so our politicians are criticizing Israel and expressing frustration, but applying no consequences. If you are a friend of Israel, sometimes being a friend of Israel means actually being pretty clear. I mean, Joe Biden, again, I'm going to use a Brexit analogy. The British American relationship is really, really strong. And the Biden administration made it very clear to the Conservative government, if you mess with the Northern Ireland peace process, there are going to be real consequences. And they were willing to give that message to us in very clear terms. Why can't they do that when it comes to Israel? It's just purely rhetorical.
To clarify a point you made a few moments ago, the United States has spent at least £17.9 billion on military aid to Israel since the war in Gaza began.
There's no end strategy. I could understand backing Israel if there was a strategy at the end of it. But Netanyahu has consistently failed to spell out an end vision, an exit strategy. So, yeah, he's successfully decimated and put on the back foot Hezbollah. And I'm not going to weep for the death of some of the Hezbollah, but I am going to weep for the thousands now of Lebanese civilians who've been also killed and millions of Lebanese that are now being displaced. I mean, where does it end? I could understand the backing if there was a strategy. It's like, we really have to take on these terrorists who have actually been threatening us. This is what we're going to do. And then we're going to rebuild in this way. They have obliterated Gaza, obliterated Gaza's health, education, water sanitation, physical infrastructure. There is nothing left for the people of Gaza. What does the day after look like?
And of course, for Biden, there will be perhaps no day after because he's not going to be there as president. And you've already touched on this, the way in which the West appears to have double standards in relation to Israel when cases are raised, for example, at the International Court of Justice, when the question of whether Netanyahu should be considered as a war criminal is raised. We're very keen to shut that down when, at the very least, it is an arguable point, I would suggest. So, final thought. For Kamala Harris, what will this mean? If you're hearing this on the doorstep, canvassing for the Democratic candidate, if the conflict continues and there is no end game for the United States, could this end up costing Kamala Harris the White House?
Absolutely. I think it's a real risk because, astonishingly, this close to the election, it still remains so close to call. And in some of the pivotal swing states, above all Michigan, there is a very large Arab American community living around Dearborn in Michigan. And they, during the primary process, a lot of them refused to vote or said no candidate as a way to register their protest about what was happening in Gaza. Now, that was a relatively risk-free endeavor at the time. It was the primaries at the time. Joe Biden was the only candidate. It didn't have any consequence. There is a question mark about whether it comes to the election itself. just a few thousand of those voters decide they're too disillusioned, they're not going to vote at all, yeah, that could decide it. And then the other reason it could decide it is because it will add fuel to the Republican narrative that the world is on fire under Biden's watch and that he's been weak. You know, he's given Ukraine enough weapons to survive, but not to win. He's given Israel enough weapons to sort of see off Hamas, but not to win. And now he's telling them to stop it just when they have Hezbollah on the back. So very dangerous.
Alex, it's been absolutely fascinating to hear from you. Really enjoyed our conversation, albeit that it's about a very sad and tragic state of affairs in the world. And if we've occasionally used language, or if I've occasionally used language incorrectly in this conversation, I hope you'll recognize that Alex and I have just tried to speak honestly and openly and truthfully
Absolutely.
about the situation as we see it. But I'm really, really grateful for that, Alex. It's been fantastic insight. Alex Hall, former UK diplomat, now a US citizen, canvassing for Kamala Harris, and giving us her insight here on the Byline podcast. And don't forget as well, this podcast is supported by the Byline Times. I've just had the new edition dropped through my door today. It's brilliant. It's a wonderful monthly periodical. You can get details on how to subscribe over at bylinetimes.com. And if you take out a subscription, you'll be helping to support this podcast as well. This episode has been produced in Birmingham by me and Harvey White for Byline Audio. We'll see you again very soon. Thanks for listening. Cheers now. Bye-bye.